Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 228, and I am the show's host, Kyle. That Congress finally passed the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, which is of course the budget that the Pentagon gets at the beginning of the year that I don't think they necessarily have to stick to and doesn't really represent all of America's national defense or military offensive spending, but this is kind of the general guideline, so another $700 billion going to be spent on that this year. Of course, the road right outside my apartment has tons of potholes in it, but, don't bother with that. We gotta spend more on F-35. So, gonna be talking about that and a bunch of other stuff today. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com and libertarianinstitute.org. Two easiest places to find the show at the Libertarian Institute, which is, of course, the great institute put together by Scott Horton, Jared LaBelle, and Sheldon Richman. You easily find the show there on the homepage. Before I get into the NDAA stuff, I did want to mention that I saw this article that was tweeted out by Aaron Mate, who it's hard to find for me somebody who has been more consistent and more up to date on the Russiagate stuff throughout this whole time, and as far as I can see, should be considered a real expert on the issue. Tweet out this article where you have some quotes from Bill Binney, former NSA technical director, and I believe he designed a surveillance program that had that been put in place, it would have been much less intrusive for the Americans, much less expensive, and would have ideally been better at collecting the data that was needed to catch or prevent terrorism, but has since become a whistleblower because the NSA decided to go with a more expensive technology that was more intrusive. He has become a member of the organization that has done a lot of very good work, Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. However, there is a particular memo from VIPS that I've talked about quite a few times on the show where Ray McGovern and Bill Binney lay out the case that the metadata produced from the Guccifer emails showed that the DNC emails, the Hillary Clinton emails, came by leak and not hack, and this was shown by the download speeds of those emails being the speed of a leak rather than a hack, and because it had transferred so far away in Eastern Europe to where Guccifer 2.0 is alleged to have had those emails, this was some pretty good proof that those emails were leaked and not hacks. Now, it turns out that Bill Binney has, I don't want to say flip-flopped, but in light of new information decided that metadata or whatever he looked at from those, Guccifer emails could have been manipulated, and it's not necessarily certain that it was then a leak and not a hack. And so, like I said, I want to talk about this first just because it's something I've talked about on the show so much. Doesn't change any of my conclusions that I have had on Russiagate so far, other than I can much less conclusively claim that the DNC emails were leaked and not hacked. Now, there are some other parts of that story that definitely haven't been debunked, such as former UK Ambassador Craig Murray making the argument that he actually met the leaker and that Julian Assange and personally informed him that was a leak. Now, Murray doesn't have anything to confirm that, and so, obviously that is just his story. However, there's no proof on the other side either. And so, my ongoing conclusion on the Russiagate is that there's no proof that Russia hacked the emails and gave those emails to WikiLeaks in order to undermine the Hillary Clinton campaign and help Donald Trump win the election. I think there's plenty of reasons that those emails could have been leaked, but the most important thing here of the whole part of the story is that those emails were authentic and it showed Hillary Clinton to be a corrupt, terrible person, and that's why the American people didn't vote for her to be president of the United States. Oh, the other thing is that, obviously no collusion between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. The P-tape either doesn't exist or, likely doesn't matter anyways, and that Donald Trump is definitely not a Manchurian candidate. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's get into the 2019 NDAA here, which again will be the bill that, authorizes defense spending for the year 2019. Now, within this bill, Congress takes the opportunity to they throw different laws in there. They throw different earmarks for the spending, saying that this $2 billion is meant for F-35s and this $10 million is for nuclear weapons. Part of the total $716 billion authorized in this legislation was part of the Overseas Contingency Fund, and this is the money used to fight the wars. I think this is what applies, whenever you have the U.S. carrying out bombing and stuff like that, it's taking out this money. And then there's also the Department of Energy spending authorized in here. Of course, their pretty much whole budget is dedicated to nuclear weapons. Now, in the past, I have said that I believe that the defense spending is really closer to $1 trillion a year. And that is because there's a lot of things that aren't included in this funding, like the veteran affairs. And so clearly part of the war is treating your soldiers when they come home. You also don't have included in here the border security for the United States. If you think that borders are important to having national security, then obviously you should be including the Department of Homeland Security and the border agencies. Also, not all the spy agencies and different intelligence agencies are funded through this authorization, and so you should probably tally up and count their funding too under here. And then, of course, they don't count the interest on the war debt that Americans are continuing to spend billions of dollars on every year. And of course, that only gets worse as we continue to pass $700 billion alleged defense authorizations. I mean, you could really call it the National Offense Authorization Act, just because of how many of the U.S. wars and how much of this spending is meant for offensive weapons and not anything that would ever really defend the American people. Now, on the episode with Will Porter, 226, and I'll link to that in the show notes page, we did go through and point out some of the other little either earmarks or provisions within this bill, including one on Yemen and Tulsi Gabbard's Stop Arming Terrorism Act. But there are some other things in this bill worth talking about. And, the first one is definitely negative, and that is there is a congressional mandate here to not have a reduction of U.S. troops in South Korea. This is unfortunate just because, if the North Koreans were really insisting that the Americans remove a few hundred or 1,000 troops from South Korea, and like kind of a good step measure that Donald Trump could take, or if Donald Trump, like I said, wanted to just take it in good faith to show the, North Koreans that, hey, if you don't give us a reason to be hostile towards you, we're not going to be. The president is now prevented from doing so. And I would much rather have seen Congress go the other way on this and say, hey, Mr. President, if you want to save a couple butts, then, why don't we here put a provision in that any troops that you remove from South Korea are all okay with us. And in fact, you may even find ways to incentivize the president. You could say, hey, and then you could take all that money and then give it to some like soldier charities or the VA or something like that. And so then Donald Trump can make a big whoop-to-do about how his agreement with North Korea has led to a situation where we removed 2,000 troops from South Korea, and then we're able to donate $5 million to veteran suicide prevention or something like that. This is now inhibited, not that it was necessarily likely, by the actions by the Congress here. The other thing is we finally did get those 55 bodies, I guess, returned to America, arrived in Hawaii by the Trump administration. I'm typically not much for, Pentagon propaganda, but in this case, I think it's going to be in the favor of the peace knits among us, where the Trump administration is going to make a big deal out of, all these families, I'm guessing, finally gain some real peace here. Not, that they haven't, I guess, accepted the death of their relative in all these years, but I'm sure a body does mean a lot after a lot of time, in, 50 years or so. And I think this is something that, is an act that, one, it should show that North Korea could follow through on some promises, as well as their much more significant concessions that they have made, like stopping the testing, stopping or destroying their nuclear testing facilities, destroying a missile launch, satellite launch site. And so the North Koreans are, seemingly taking steps towards, denuclearization, the peace process with the Americans. And the important thing to remember here is that the North Koreans see this as a 3-step process, and not 3 steps to necessarily be carried out simultaneously, but, ending the war, restoring relations, normalize relations, creating a really peace between and on the Korean Peninsula, and that at that point North Korea will start to get rid of their nuclear weapons once they're shown that they don't have a reason to have them anymore. Another provision, and me and Will talked about this one a little bit, and it has to do with Turkey and the F-35 sales. Now, I just wanted to update here and say that Turkey is now threatening to go to arbitration because I guess the United States has previously signed a deal with Turkey dealing with, these F-35 sales, and Turkey, I guess, is now planning on backing out, or the United States with the United States in the NDAA saying that we can't sell these planes to Turkey. They're very upset about this. Now, the other thing going on with Turkey, in addition to the complications between the United States and Turkey over the Iranian oil sanctions, is Turkey has since 2016, I believe 21 months in total now, held an American citizen who had lived in Turkey for 2 decades. He's a U.S. pastor in prison because they allege he had a role in the 2016 coup against Erdogan. I haven't seen any proof to suggest that that's true, and they have now released that guy under house arrest, and the Trump administration has put some pressure on Turkey to basically release him and hopefully let him leave the country and live a free life. Turkey, I'm not sure what they're doing with the pastor and why they're so insistent on not giving him up. Maybe they do have actual proof he was involved in the coup. Maybe they think that they could trade this guy to the Americans for a Turkish exile living in the United States. His name is Gulan. I think he lives up in the Poconos in Pennsylvania, actually. And Erdogan claims that Gulan was involved in the 2016 coup and that he, I guess, would have been the beneficiary of the coup. Again, I haven't seen any proof that this is true, and at this point, I kind of doubt that it is. I'm not saying that it's impossible. It's just, we're now saying that 2018 and nobody's provided any evidence that Gulen was really behind it, so maybe he wasn't. But Turkey's reluctance to release this U.S. pastor has now led the United States to put sanctions on 2 Turkish officials. And, this is just a really interesting situation since Turkey is a NATO member country. It's a U.S. ally. It's actually the NATO country. Well, at one point it had the second largest army. I'm not sure after the purges by Erdogan if that's actually still the case or if he's been able to replenish those ranks. But, Turkey's a very significant state for NATO and as a U.S. ally in the Middle East region, a heavy U.S. ally, especially when it came to the Syrian civil war. It looks like relations between these two countries continue to go in the wrong direction. Also, the U.S. has some nuclear weapons at the Insular Lake Air Base in Turkey. The last thing I'll mention is about Yemen. And again, me and Will talked about this a little bit on 226, but to continue, I don't think that the passage of this bill is going to mean that the United States is going to stop supporting the Saudi-led coalition that's waging a war of, attempted genocide against the people of Yemen. My guess is that, there's enough cutouts in that legislation that's going to allow, the Secretary of State to certify that the Saudis are abiding by the deal, even if they're not. But they're going to say, oh yeah, well, per the agreement here, they had to be killing less civilians than they did last year. And oh, look, there's 10 less people dead. And so now we're going to certify them and say it's okay. And the reality is that Saudi Arabia has not let up against the people of Yemen. In fact, there was a hospital bombed, by early reports, 26 people were killed, in Hodeidah when Saudi Arabia launched an airstrike against that city. That ceasefire is now over, by the way, for the port of Hodeidah. Very unfortunate because, that's just a critical. Every aid organization is warning that this could double the number of people in need of food in Yemen by the Saudi attack on the city of Hodeidah and the major importing area for Yemen, the port of Hodeidah. Now, the Houthis have launched some missiles at Saudi ships in the Red Sea, causing some minor damage to one ship now. And I think at one point, maybe a year or so ago, they actually bombed a Emirati ship as well and did some more significant damage to that one. But they haven't sunk a ship or anything like that. And they are targeting more economic and civilian targets like oil tankers and not just Saudi battleships. Now this has led, Saudi Arabia to, as they would say, resuming airstrikes against Yemen. I'm not sure if that's the reason why or if that's even where the missiles being fired at Saudi ships are coming from. But, this is obviously something that the Saudis are concerned about and are trying to address. And Yemen's missile program has played Saudi Arabia throughout this entire war. they keep carrying out airstrikes saying it's targeting the Yemeni missile program, and Yemen keeps having missiles to shoot at Saudi Arabia and Saudi targets. And, these are obviously weapons of war being fired at civilian targets, and that's terrible. But, this just goes to show that these kind of wars don't work. This is the same problem the United States had with Iraq, is that they couldn't destroy all Saddam's Scud missiles. Now, the Houthis have said they're going to call off those missile attacks for the next 2 weeks. And, I guess we'll see what happens at this, hopefully it has the Saudis let up, but, the Houthis made their announcement, before Saudi Arabia bombed the hospital, so it doesn't seem that way. Want to update Iran talks. I know this was mostly the focus of the last show, but some new developments since then. Mike Pompeo has come out and basically put preconditions and more or less unmeetable preconditions on talks between the United States and Iran. I don't know if Iran was going to enter into the talks that Trump had offered anyways, so it might not make that big of a difference, but it is unfortunate that the United States seems to be picking up a little bit more of a hostile position, maybe because the Iranians didn't immediately jump at the U.S. opportunity for talks. By the foreign policy playbook I was talking about in the last episode, I think the assessment Trump will make by Iran saying, we're not going to come on our knees, hands and knees to the table, is that, the maximum pressure campaign hasn't had enough time to bite yet. And he's going to go back to that until, the Iranians are ready to talk. Now, I was pretty pleased to read that Trista Parsi article, who is a great expert on U.S. and Iranian relations, who kind of came and said, there is a problem with the Iranian talks, and that is Trump is either going to have to make concessions or take a deal that's, I guess, not quite as great as the deal before. And, this is going to cause a lot of real problems because I'm not sure Trump's ego is going to let him, do that. And so not saying that talks between the U.S. and Iran are a bad thing, because there's certainly a lot of things the country should agree on. There's no reason for the United States to be at war or, have hostile relations or tensions with Iran. But, this is where we find ourselves, and if talking helps us move into the right direction, all the better. Update on Syria. We have Assad basically recapturing southwest Syria from the rebels. This is kind of the location of the start of the war 7 years ago now, and it's good to see that. I'm guessing for more and more people in Syria, life is returning to whatever normal looks like. Of course, Israeli missiles continue to rain down from the sky, and I'm sure that doesn't help that situation at all. Now, just to update, if you're looking at a map of Syria, and it's kind of like a right-leaning rhombus, you have southwest Syria now clear, the Damascus area now clear, and then there's a pocket of ISIS in kind of southwest, but not really extremely southwest Syria, that's surrounded by the Syrian army. There's then, if you continue along and you're kind of just in south central Syria along the border with Jordan, you have the U.S. position at the border crossing Al-Tanaf, and then U.S.-backed rebels that are protected by the United States within I believe, 55 to 60 kilometer radius of that military base the United States holds. Then if you go more central Syria, you have the Syrian desert and a large but mostly unpopulated area of Syria that's controlled by ISIS. North Syria along the Turkish border, and it's more just north central Syria now, is controlled by a combination of Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, or HTS are the three kind of names of the real crazy jihadist guys, and then various other rebel groups that are various degrees of jihadist scattered throughout the Idlib and North Aleppo province. You also have, a lot of Turkish involvement here. And so, these are the pockets of the ISIS on the east side of the Euphrates, or the west side of the Euphrates River in Syria, around the Assad-controlled territory. Now, in West Syria, you still do have pretty much the whole west of the Euphrates controlled by the Syrian rebels, and they're the proxy force of the United States, not the Syrian rebels, the Syrian Kurds, and they are the proxy force of the United States. Those those Kurds are now actually looking at engaging in talks with the Syrian central government and Assad, and we'll be interesting to see where these talks go and what that means for the future of the United States and Syria. But I think at this point, the United States is still going to eventually have to enter into some sort of negotiations, likely with Russia as the intermediary between the United States and the Syrian Kurds and Russia, and Assad. Again, on episode 226 with Will Porter, Will brings up an interesting story on Moon of Alabama, and that is this kind of proposed idea that Israel wants the Iranians to move 100 kilometers away from the border of the Golan Heights in Syria. The Golan Heights is occupied Israeli territory. It's actually owned by Syria, but they took it in a war, I believe the 67 war, so a long time ago, and have occupied it since. So the Assad government has taken this whole area, but the Israelis continue to insist that no Iranian forces should be within 100 kilometers of this area. One of the problems of that is that the capital city of Damascus is actually within 100 kilometers of that borderline. And so I doubt that the Iranians are going to have no military presence in Damascus. Now, Russia proposed 85 kilometers, and I think that 85 kilometers is right around Damascus. So I'm assuming that Russia made this proposal with the understanding that the Iranians would be able to hang around Damascus. But the Israelis rejected it and said that no, the Iranians had to leave Syria completely in order for them to be happy with the situation, I guess. Now, there's some irony here in that Israel always complains that the problem with the Palestinians is that they make these reasonable proposals and then they don't even have anybody to negotiate. The Palestinians just pee on the paper and leave. But essentially that's what you have the Israelis doing here. Russia is making an offer saying that, hey, we'll keep the Iranians, 85 kilometers from your border. This is what you're all concerned about is Iran being on your border. You're saying, no, that's not good enough. And in fact, we're not even going to negotiate. They have to leave the entirety of Syria. Which is obviously not going to happen because there's still a lot of pockets of rebel fighters left around Syria, and the Iranians are a very important fighting force for the Syrian army. So I want to wrap up talking about Afghanistan, and that is we have an offensive by the Taliban against the ISIS state Khorasan group that controls territory around Syria or around Afghanistan. I believe this is in a northern area of Afghanistan. The Taliban launched an offensive against ISIS-K and actually killed about 40 and then drove another between 200 and 250 to surrender, and they end up surrendering, I believe, to the Afghan government, avoiding surrendering to the Taliban, thinking, I don't know, maybe they'll get a better deal that way or something like that. So I think this kind of in a way goes to show that the United States doesn't have to be everywhere in the world to make sure ISIS doesn't exist. And it turns out that some of these local fighting forces are probably more effective at it than the Americans are. So who would have figured people are better at fighting terrorists in their own backyards than somebody from thousands of miles away is. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. I hope y'all enjoyed it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, immersionnews.com is my news website. If you really like the show and want to support it, and I actually got, I think 6 or so patrons now, so it's really cool to have these monthly, the amount of money I'm getting a month actually means something. With that, I'm going to be improving the show. I got some intro music coming up. Hopefully in the next couple of episodes, I'll have it all ready for you and introduced. So, thank you so much for those of you who do that. Patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.